Okay, everyone. Hi, thanks for joining us. And today here is Walter Colebatch from Motorcy Extreme. Welcome, Walter.
Thanks, Lyndon. Cheers, good to be here and kick off the first one of what I think will be a very interesting series of discussions.
Yeah, I hope so. I have no idea how long it's going to be, so I hope you're sitting comfortably. It might take a while to get through this, but we'll see how we get on. Just a little bit of intro from my side to Walter and how I know Walter. I was introduced to Walter by the guys at Adventure Spec before Races to Places, really, because Walter had done many trips over in Siberia and kind of in the eastern part of the world, and had a lot of tracks and information about places to travel, really good, strong adventure travel on a motorcycle. And so I was put in touch with him, and to be honest, Walter kind of paved the way, really, for the first 30,000 kilometres of Races to Places. I think it's fair to say, Walter. I mean, without your information and the help that you gave myself and Lucas to get across to Magadan, it wouldn't have been the trip that it was, and that information was really useful. So for people wondering where I got to know Walter, that's how it came about. But Walter, you've done far more than just help me in the first part of Races to Places with all your adventures across Russia and the likes and the stands. And do you want to just sort of tell people a little bit about the trips that you've done and things like that, just to give people a bit of a heads up?
Well, I first began in the whole adventure motorcycling thing way back in the 1990s. I think it was kind of born out of some pretty unsuccessful or pretty frustrating times backpacking in South America, where I just started getting the feeling that the whole kind of Lonely Planet backpacking thing was basically just a tour for old Hong Kong or Japanese ladies instead of having an old woman with an umbrella in front of people leading this group around. You had this book which people referred to as the Bible, the Lonely Planet, and everyone took exactly the same buses, stayed in exactly the same places, had exactly the same travel schedule. And I thought, there's just got to be something a lot more independent than this. There's just got to be a much more interesting way to do this.
Yeah.
And I got the idea to do it by motorcycle, and a friend of mine and I had the idea to kick off from Japan and ride around Siberia for a bit, and that really grew into what became the Tokyo to London project. Which was a 6-month ride from, as the name suggests, Tokyo to London. And I actually had to learn to ride a motorcycle to do that. So my whole start in motorcycling was traveling on a Transalp, and it kind of morphed from that to, as you want to go to more and more interesting and out of the way places, you develop much more of an off-road focus. You want to get away from the sort of places that everyone else has been, and you hear about this or that, and you want to work out how to get there. And it just sort of, so I basically came to adventure motorcycling not so much from most guys who sort of come from like an enduro or off-road sort of background, and then start traveling with it as you did, and as my good friend Terry Brown did. I sort of came from the opposite direction, where I had no motorcycling experience, learned to ride to travel, and then learned to ride off-road to travel to much more interesting places, and
Right.
It sort of came at it that way.
Yeah. Cool. Now, when I talk to anybody about traveling around the world, and including myself, people always discuss, what was the craziest moment, and there's moments on your travels, and you've done many travels, I'm sure you have one too, but on each one of these podcasts we're going to talk about so there I was moment. So when you're like, so there I was, and so I'm going to share one of mine, there's so many from my travels around the world, to give you an idea. So there I was, stripping off butt naked with a 60-year-old woman from Argentina, from Brazil, and jumping in the Arctic Ocean naked. So there's one. You see what I mean? So what was your so there I was moment from your travels?
Right. I'm not sure that I have one to compete with that, or if I did, I'm not sure I'm prepared to share it just yet, maybe on my deathbed, but On that first trip, on that Tokyo to London trip, I had a very hair-raising experience, which is probably my "so there it was" moment. And it was kind of, so there I was riding across the Central Asian steppe, and we'd been sort of warned always about the shady, dangerous characters up ahead. And after 3 or 4 months, you get tired of hearing it, because everybody in every village says, "Oh, we're okay here, but the next village is pretty dangerous."
Yeah.
And so there I was riding across the northern Kazakh steppe. It was 1994, which was really a time of bandit country in the former Soviet Union. And way up in the distance, there's just no cars anywhere. It's just dead flat. And then way up in the distance, you can kind of see 3-4 kilometers down the road, there's what looks like a truck by the side of the road. And as we get closer and closer and closer, about 6 or 7 guys step out in front of the truck with like bullet belts, guns, the whole lot. Middle of nowhere, there's not a soul around, nothing for 50, 100 kilometers. And these guys pull us over and sort of quite aggressively start hassling us and asking us, what we're carrying and everything like that. And we eventually managed to explain to them that we're just a couple of students riding motorcycles from Tokyo to London.
Yeah.
And we were kind of literally shitting ourselves at this time. It would have taken them absolutely nothing to pop us off and take all the camera gear, all the motorcycles, whatever. There's just no trace. The middle of nowhere.
Yeah.
They actually found it hilarious. They thought 2 guys riding motorcycles to London. You guys are insane. They started laughing, joking, patting us on the back, and eventually saying, "You guys get out of here. These are dangerous parts." And we sort of rode out of sight, sort of 6-7 kilometers down the road, and then took an enormous piss under a tree by the side of the road. And that was really probably the most hair-raising moment for me on my travels.
Yeah. I've had a few moments similar like that myself, but I need to get writing my book so that I can share some of them, because I have to explain them in detail. But thanks for sharing that. So we're here today to talk about, just one thing. You said 1994 when you were talking about that. I didn't even have a motorcycle license yet when I was in 1994, Walter. I hadn't even started riding bikes on the road, so I can't imagine.
As I said, I only got one 6 months earlier.
Nice. Okay, so we're here today to talk about the evolution of adventure motorcycling, really, and take a look back where we remembered it starting and how it's evolved and how the motorcycles evolved, and just have some general chit chat about what we think about it and how it's going. And then we've got a ton of questions from my Patreons. And thanks for everybody that's joined up on Patreon, and also some from social media as well. There's loads of questions. I've tried to group them together, and we probably won't get through them all, but what we'll do is we'll just have that general discussion about the bikes, and then we can about the bikes and adventure motorcycling, and then we can come on to onto the questions. So let's just start at the beginning. I mean, what's the first thing you remember about adventure motorcycling? What's the first thing you saw that said, "Oh, that looks cool, that would be a good idea"?
Well, I think for me it was kind of a post facto realization, because when we started this whole Tokyo to London trip, we knew jack shit, and I was in Australia at the time, and the range of what you'd call adventure motorcycles in Australia was pretty much zero. Mm-hmm. Australia was kind of like you either ride a dirt bike or a sports bike or a chopper, and that was it. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really until towards the end of that Tokyo to London trip that we arrived in Europe in late 1994. And I remember riding through the streets of Paris, and every second motorcycle was an Africa Twin or a Super Tenere, and they're just doing wheelies away from the traffic lights. And it was really quite amazing to me when we got to Europe how much interest there was in what we did, what we'd just done, and the story, and all the major motorcycle magazines wanted to do a story on it, wanted to write about it, and it was clear that the whole adventure motorcycling space in Europe in 1994 was basically miles apart from everything else on the planet. And that was really where the things like the Africa Twin and the Super Teneres and everything had their roots. And that as I sort of discovered later, that really sort of went back to people like Thierry Sabine mucking around in the African desert and getting lost and everything, and and really the birth. It seems to me that the birth of the and you can elaborate on this a lot better perhaps. But the birth of the adventure motorcycling scene and the birth of the rally scene really sort of came out of those roots in Europe in the late 1970s, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, the first thing I knew about adventure motorcycling was obviously the Dakar Rally. I mean, I watched it on the TV as a child. I was probably about 10 years old when I first saw it, maybe a little bit younger. But, you know, I was born in 78, and I think the first Dakar Rally was 79. I think so. So, you know, it was right around the time that I was born when it started, so in the 70s. And those guys were the true adventure motorcyclists. I mean, if you look at what we have today in the rally world in terms of navigation equipment and safety devices and everything, they really did wing it. You know, they had their motorcycle, they rode across the desert, and they got lost in the desert. I mean, it was crazy stories coming out of that. And what an adventure indeed for those guys. And that went on for years, you know, until things developed. So I think clearly it probably did come from that era, what we saw, but then there's the likes of Chris Scott that's been, you know, traveling and exploring for a long time. But I think, you know, the motorcycles typically, when I first started to see like adventure motorcycles on the market, it was the likes of the GSs and stuff, you know, in the 80s. That's what I sort of remember. Teneres, Kajivas, all the bikes that you sort of saw racing the Dakar Rally, they then came into the market where people could buy them. I mean, I was too young to have one, but I had pictures of them on my wall for sure. So we had all those big bikes, and then the moving on from that, you know, really the birth of the DGS. I mean, for me, GS 1100, GS 1150 was really what I remembered in terms of a production bike, like really coming to the market and in the masses, you know, and people starting to ride those. And that was probably like, early 90s, I think, something around about there.
Well, I can fill you in exactly on that, because I have an interesting story about that.
Yeah, go on.
That whole thing. Well, I said it was 1993 when we were planning this trip, and you know, as a couple of students, we didn't have any money or anything like that, so we thought, okay, well, let's see if we can get sponsored and get other people to pay for this entire trip. And we very, very nearly did it. And the first step to that was like getting media interest and all that sort of stuff. And once armed with kind of piles of media interest, we could then go to the motorcycle companies and the equipment suppliers and see if they would back us. And you know, we wrote to various motorcycle companies in Australia, and the most interest we got was from Honda and from BMW. And we'd sort of written to BMW. They had this Funduro thing that came out in 1993, which was a 650 single cylinder. And so we wrote to BMW and said, listen, you know, we really think that they'd be the ideal bikes for this kind of trip. Would you like to get involved? And BMW Australia sort of wrote back straight away and said, this sounds fantastic. We forwarded your proposal on to BMW in Germany and BMW in Japan. They have much bigger budgets than us. And BMW in Japan was very interested. They were building this BMW museum in Tokyo, and they said, listen, you could do these trips, and then we could hang the bikes up from the ceiling at this new BMW museum in Tokyo to demonstrate their prowess. But we think you're barking up the wrong tree. The F650, no, it's not the right bike. We've got this brand new bike out now, this 1100 GS, and they sort of sent us through the details of this bike, and I'm thinking, Jesus Christ, it's a fucking tank. And I think what's particularly relevant about that is that was the first time that somebody had taken the idea of an adventure bike and really separated it significantly from the idea of a rally bike, because as you mentioned, until then, you know, you had the Honda Africa Twins, you had the Yamaha Tenere, Super Tenere, the Kajiva Elephants, even the BMW Airhead boxes were all very, very, very closely related to what they raced in Dakar. You know, and then BMW came out with the giant kind of 1100 what do they call it? They call it the oil head rather than the airhead, and it was a very different proposition in terms of weight, in terms of height off the ground. Your center of mass was not only much larger, but then much higher off the ground, and that was the beginning, if you like, of this divergence between rally and adventure bikes, which until that point had been very tightly related.
Yep.
I think there had been a very tight connection.
Yep.
And some of the adventure bikes you could buy were only sort of really minor changes from the production rally bikes that
for sure.
that some of the guys are putting out.
Yeah, and I think we're probably jumping forwards, but when we come on to talking about the KTM's, we'll come back to that about the similarities between Dakar race bikes and production bikes. But I think there's another step before we get to that, and that's the coming on towards Long Way Round, the Long Way Round series with you and Charlie, the 1150 GS, the hard luggage, the GS Adventure, those bikes coming onto the market, which really did take over. Like people went and bought those bikes. They'd seen what was possible on a motorcycle. Much because of those guys, because it came to the mainstream and it got onto people's, people saw it on television, people saw the movies, the DVDs, and they wanted a bit of it. They wanted that experience, and they got out there, and to some extent I was one of those people too. I was one of those people. KTM were racing the Dakar, BMW were racing the Dakar, but KTM came out, let's say 2001 time. KTM developed the 950 V-twin Adventure, Rally actually, in 2001 for the Dakar, which ultimately went on to be a successful Dakar racer. And I think it's fair to say that the KTM 950 Adventure is probably, still today, the only bike that was produced that is produced directly as a result of a factory race bike. I mean, we do have like the GSs and stuff like that, which were a very similar base, like you said, but I think the 950 was probably the last one, it's fair to say, because
it's probably the last one. I'd say that the early 640 Adventures were probably very similar. I mean, they were very similar to the KTM single cylinder rally bikes. Yeah. But they are the only two, I think, since the 80s.
Yeah, and I think there became a point then at the 950 where there was a split, and the Dakar race bikes went one way, but the adventure motorcycling market kept going the other way, if you know what I mean. So we had, I was the one. I jumped in. My first adventure bike was a KTM 950. I was torn, to be honest. I wanted an Africa Twin. I wanted a GS. And then I sort of saw the 950, and I was like, that's kind of more sporty. It's a bit more off-road orientated. And to be honest, one just came up cheap, and that's why I ended up with and it was local. And the guy said it would, it wasn't local, but the guy said he would deliver it to me. So I ended up with a KTM 950, and you know what? It was an awesome bike, and I've still got it today. It's been through 160,000 kilometers and 3 engine rebuilds now, and it's still here, and I hardly use it, but it's still a fantastic bike, and it took me on some great trips, great places, and taught me a lot about riding big, heavy adventure bikes. And in some respects, that's what really got me into rallying, and probably helped to make my rallying successful, because I was so used to riding the big, heavy bike over all kinds of terrain, because it's all that I knew, it's all I had. I didn't have a smaller bike. So, KTM bringing that bike out, I mean, it's dead for a long time. We got 950, 990, then we got the 1190, and now we're on the 1290. We've got the 1050 and 1090 came along as well. But we've seen a bit of a U-turn just recently with the 790. And that was, in some regards, a little bit of a surprise when it happened. But clearly there was a desire by the manufacturers to try and go a little bit smaller, to say actually you don't need 160 horsepower in an adventure bike, and to save maybe 30-40 kilograms would be a bonus, and to get the weight a little bit lower down, more akin to a rally bike. We've seen the birth of the 790, which I think you'll agree has been really successful. And I see lots and lots of people riding them, you know, all over the world, and I've seen travelers and adventures on them. We got Yamaha, you know, Yamaha have got the XTZ660, had it for a while. We've seen them recently launch the T7, again, very popular bike. A lot of people ask me, you know, oh, what do you think to the T7, the 790? Well, to be honest, my riding experience on both of those bikes is quite limited. You know, I've ridden both of them, but only for short periods of time, so I'm not really in a position to say. And personally, I've been, you know, I've got on off the big bikes and onto the rally bikes, which I've been using myself, and the 690 factory rally, which I used on Races to Places. That I've kind of been spoilt with those bikes, because they're like they've got the capability of the big bikes, but they're lighter and in a smaller package. So I kind of got spoilt that I'm at the point where I don't really have a desire to like get a 790 because I've got the rally bike. But for sure, if I didn't have the rally bikes, and I think back to when I first started adventure motorcycling, I'd be jumping on a 790 or a T7 today for sure. So,
yeah, I think you know, it's sort of getting back to sort of continue that evolution of adventure bikes. You know, there was that split, if you like, that started with the 1100 GS, and for whatever reason, I think in the second half of the 90s, Honda and Yamaha gave up. You know, they used to own the space in the late 80s and the early 90s.
That's
the
true,
whole adventure bike
that's
space,
true.
and they just dropped out of the picture. They completely dropped the ball.
Yep.
And you know, KTM hadn't emerged yet as an adventure bike maker. They were just a dirt bike manufacturer in the 90s. And so, you know, the only adventure bike really there was by the late 90s. I mean, you had this kind of outdated Africa Twin, which was like really old at the time. And then BMW had their bikes, and to be honest, I think the whole adventure riding scene shrank in the late 90s. You know, I think it went from that point in the early 90s when I was in Paris, and there were just adventure bikes everywhere. Yeah. Everyone was doing trips down to the Sahara. Yeah. And it disappeared off the radar, really, I think, until the Ewan McGregor Charlie Borman thing. Yeah. And you know, like you, it actually kind of woke me up. I hadn't done a trip for a while. Yeah. I went out and bought a 1200 GS Adventure as soon as they were launched in 2006, and thought, okay, I've got to get back into this because I miss it. Yeah. I remember watching that series through Siberia and thinking, yeah, there's so much more I want to do, because I sort of had been there before and really thought it was exciting. Yeah. And I had that 1200 for a while, and you know, rode it around Europe, and it was great fun. I took it to Morocco, and it was just heavy work. And then I sold it. I thought, this is just not the right bike for the kind of stuff that I want to do. So sort of moved back to sort of single-cylinder light bikes for the first Sibirski Extreme trip in 2009, and then sort of... So, and again, it was a similar thing. In 2009, I went to BMW and talked about getting some sponsorship from them, and the guy from BMW UK was a really open-minded guy, and he said, listen, it's We've obviously had some good success backing stuff before. We like the fact that you've done stuff before, and have a bit of a record. And so yeah, you can have one of these bikes. But why do you want to have this 650? Because I'd asked them for a sort of an X challenge. When you know, surely, you know, if you want to go around the world, the bike we really want to promote is the 1200. And I had to sort of really sell the fact that I really, really, really don't want to get a 1200 to go to, you know, unknown roads in Siberia.
So let's talk about that a little bit before we go on to the sort of getting a bit closer to today and today's adventure bikes. But you decided to go smaller. If I look at my trip Races to Places, you know, I loved the KTM 950, and I was going to rebuild it for my World Trip Races to Places, but I really was longing for something a little bit smaller and lighter, with the equivalent kind of performance. And because
you did the Salt and Gold on the 950, right?
Correct,
in 2008,
right?
Was it end of 2008?
Correct. So I went with Austin Vince and Dave Lomax from Adventure Spec, and the guys that did the Salt and Gold, that we made the DVD Salt and Gold 2009, and you know, I went on my KTM 950, and I remember those guys, they were on CRF 450X, DRZ. I think Robin Webb was on a TTR 250 from memory. I can't remember exactly. So they were all on smaller bikes. And then I came along last minute and said, yeah, I want to take my KTM 950 because it's all I knew and what I had. And they'd obviously had a desire to go smaller, but I wasn't there yet. Went on the trip. I actually loved it. Did the whole trip, no problems at all on the KTM 950, apart from running out of fuel before everybody else because it was a little bit thirsty, even with an extra fuel tank. But
Rod Curry told me in 2012 this Linden kid turned up on this 950 and they're all shaking their heads thinking what's this gonna be like, and then he rode the pants off all of us. That's his words.
It's really funny actually, because they actually said you can come but not on the 950 was the first. You can come but you need to come on a 450, and my reply to that was, well, I'm not coming if I can't bring my 950, because I'd ridden so far on this 950 all around the world.
Yeah.
I even raced the Baja 1000 on a KTM 950, so I knew how to ride the bike, and I really wanted to take that bike. It was set up how I like it. I love riding it. The V-twin was awesome. So I did the trip on it, and yeah, we had a great time. You know, Rod was on a 620, I believe. Yeah, you just mentioned Rod. He was on a 620 KTM. And I have to say, Rod, if you're watching this, like, you were such a strong man at that when we did that, because he smashed his collarbone in like 4 places, and he rode for like 2 more days, like with a completely smashed collarbone. I mean, the pain that guy must have been going through was crazy, but different story. But
I think there's a couple of motivations for things like that. When you're in countries like that, you think, well, do I really want to go to the hospital, or is it better just to suck it up?
Well, let's just talk about that for a minute. Tanzania, 2019. Yeah. So there I am in Tanzania, 2019. I had a front blowout on my bike. So I had just hit a piece of volcanic rock, sharp edge, pinched flat, but, you know, pinched flat. Yeah. Not a very good quality tube, because I probably bought it in the middle of Africa somewhere. The tube split, instant deflation. I went down so fast, like I had no chance to save it. Like, you know, I like to think I'm a half decent rider, but by the time I'd got warning that my front tyre was flat, I was on the ground. So I tried to slow it down, fell down, smashed my hand and my knee, knew it was bad, could literally not lift the bike up. Got back to Arusha. Spent 2 weeks sitting out in Arusha fixing the bike, hoping my hand would get better and my knee and everything, and was convinced that it wasn't broken, because I did go to get an x-ray and they said it wasn't broken, so I was like, yeah, it's fine. It was still hurting like crazy, but I still got back on the bike and I still carried on riding for another couple of days before I realised that actually something's really wrong in there, because the pain was so bad. And I just, other times, I think Sonora Rally. I mean, Sonora Rally is a 5-day rally. Day 3, bang, I had a simple little fall, twisted my ankle around, broke my ankle in 2 places. I knew it, I heard it pop. I jumped back on the bike, rode to the finish, and then I was like, well, if I can finish a stage, then I can finish the rally. So I did the whole rally with a broken ankle before I even went to the hospital. And it's amazing what you can, like, dig out of the bank, you know, the energy bank, and the willpower to do something, and you try and convince yourself that there's nothing wrong, you know, and it's okay, you can just carry on. You're like, you know, but sometimes I have to remind myself that, you know, I'm not superhuman, and I have to get myself to the hospital. Camilla's really good at telling me that, you know, get yourself to the hospital. But
maybe she hasn't. Has she seen inside some of these hospitals?
Oh yeah, maybe. Yeah, no, probably not. Yeah, but I did my ribs recently here at home. Yeah. And I was like, oh, it's just bruised, but like obviously I was just like, ugh! And I couldn't laugh, I couldn't sneeze. It was terrible. She's like,
cough, laugh, sneeze. Yeah.
Get to the hospital.
That's when you know you've cracked a rib.
Yeah. So anyway, getting off track a little bit, but yeah, went on the 950 on Salt and Gold. Really loved it. And I even went on after that to race the 950. So I did the UK Rally Challenge on the 950 and loved it. But that was the point when I was starting to consider doing some rally racing. And rally racing, the bikes had changed dramatically. So we saw the banning of the multi-cylinder bikes. So that was the first thing that came. Multi-cylinder bikes were banned. And then I think it was maximum capacity 700cc, single. Then we saw the 2009, was it? 2009, I think. Yeah, when the first sort of talk about 450cc maximum capacity, and then in 2010 we saw the factory teams with 450 rally bikes. Then we saw the 450 Rally come out in 2011 as a customer bike. So we've gone very quickly from V-twin 1000cc, parallel twin 1100, 1200, you know, all those, and in rally racing terms, down to a single cylinder four-stroke engine, 450, in the period of what, a number of years, very quickly. I think
less than a decade.
Yeah, and that was it happened quickly in racing, but there was a big delay in the adventure bike market, because while the racing was reducing size and capacity and still achieving the same speeds and the same capabilities and the same somewhat reliability and even more, which is surprising, because the biggest question at first when they went to the single cylinders and the 450s especially was reliability, and they've absolutely proven that they're reliable, and only now have we started to see smaller adventure bikes starting to make an appearance. And again, you're talking like a decade later, yeah.
I think when that first shift away from multi-cylinders was what, 2002 or so.
Yeah.
And again, that just widened the gap between adventure bikes and rally bikes.
Yep.
And yeah, I think it's only quite recently, really the last few years, that we've seen that really wide gap narrow. Because I mean, in 2015, you know, there was no 790 on the market. There was no T700. There was none of that stuff. There was just people like Honda putting out 260 kilogram New Africa twins with and that sort of stuff. You know, Moto, Marini, you name it. Ducati, everybody coming out with 230 plus kilogram adventure bikes, which were clearly really designed to ride on the road, but at the same time convey an image, an edge of an image. And I think probably the most striking thing that Ewan and Charlie and Long Way Around did for adventure motorcycling was they helped change for a long time. If you look at the 1990s, the biggest motorcycle manufacturer in the world, or the Western world, it's been Harley Davidson, and it's not because everybody's a bandito or whatever. It's because everybody wants a slice of bad boy, right? Everyone wanted a slice to put a bandana on their head in the States and just ride down to the shop and buy your milk. Yeah. And it was an image thing more than anything. It was just like, I want a slice of that image. And I think what Ewan and Charlie did was they changed that to the image slice that everybody, the doctors and the dentists and everybody else wanted to get out of motorcycling now was not this bad boy image. It was the rough adventure guy image, and that I think is the single biggest driver behind the expansion in the adventure bike market since 2004.
Yeah, for sure.
Is just regular bikers who want to get a slice of that adventurous image, and they don't really plan on doing any sort of trips through Africa or anything like that. But they might start doing trips to the Dolomites or whatever, which they wouldn't have done before. And to a large degree, certainly until 2015, that was what the manufacturers recognized, and that was the market that they catered to when they built adventure bikes. It certainly wasn't to build a bike to go to Africa or to ride around the world.
And that's a really important point there, is about the manufacturers producing bikes to cater for a market. Because people, I get it all the time, like, when will KTM bring out a Basel bike, in reality...
Yeah, not going to happen.
Exactly, it's not going to happen, because in reality...
There's no market.
The people that want a bike like the one that I use to travel around the world, it's high-end, it's a high-cost, low product number, so they're going to produce minimum numbers of them. Even if they did it, they'd struggle to sell a few thousand, because they're expensive, and you can do the same thing on on a lesser value bike. So it's a very small niche. It's a very small market of people that want those bikes. And you think, no, thousands of one. Look at all the kits out there. There's not that many. You know, there's 2,000 or 3,000.
Yeah, it's in the hundreds.
There. Exactly.
I think it's in the hundreds per year.
Yeah, so maximum there's a couple of thousand kits out there. It's not enough for the big manufacturers like KTM.
No.
One of the biggest, if not the biggest at the moment in terms of numbers of motorcycles produced. They're not interested in that. They need to produce 10,000 minimum of one.
Well, I think
product.
10,000 a year of each product. Anything less than that is really peripheral. And obviously they build the rally bike, but that's obviously has a particular purpose in a particular market, and it's not built as a profit center. It's built as a marketing exercise.
Absolutely, KTM purely produced the KTM factory replica, which is available to the customers, which is the bikes you've seen me race ride, the 690, 450, etc.
I got one too.
Yeah, you do actually. Yeah, I built you a bike. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, some people might not know that have you actually used it yet?
I've used it for riding around the car park in Holland.
So
waiting for the right opportunity.
Yeah, you did the right thing though. You got it while they were reasonable to buy. Now they've just gone like
well, that was the driver. I mean, I'd always had the idea after even 2009 when I was trying to work out a bike to get.
Yeah.
I was sort of even going back to the whole Tokyo to London trip when I used the Transalp, and I remember it sort of sucked going across Mongolia, and so I thought, okay, anything I get has to be smaller, lighter, single cylinder. It's got to be tough as hell.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to have good fuel range. And I was looking at in 2009, I was looking at the 690 Rally, and I thought, there's just no way you can get one if you're sort of not a rally rider, so forget it.
Yeah, back then it was very much like that. Yeah.
It had crossed my mind that could well be an ideal bike for the purpose, because it has, and this gets back to the whole rally adventure bike thing, where for the kind of adventure riding that I like to do, and I guess you like to do, you want to do it. You want to ride aggressively. You want the bike to be super tough. You want it to have a really long fuel range. You want it to be light and sporty, and that's what the rally bikes are built for. They're built to be tough. They're built to have the long fuel range. They're built to go fast and have good suspension. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. The adventure riding and rally riding came from the same seeds.
Exactly.
It's a case of getting your hand on one, and unfortunately I couldn't get my hands on one back then. But I remember when you did it in 2014, because we hooked up a couple of times in 2014.
Yeah.
And by the time you got to Magadan, I remember thinking to myself, right, I'm convinced that the bike is reliable enough, tough enough, whatever to do this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And then the following year, you said you were going to start making them available to the public. And I thought, knowing how rare the bike is, if I don't get in now, the price of them is going to just go up and up and up. And that's what's happened. So even though I didn't have a particular use for the bike in my head at the time, I thought, if I don't get in now, I'll never get one.
Okay, so the question that everybody's going to want to ask is, when are you going to do a trip on that bike, Walter? And me included. I want to ask that question.
When am I going to do a trip full stop at the moment is my question.
And given the current timing, there's a lot of questions about that coming from fans and stuff. But
one of the trips, one of the sort of potential trips I had in mind for this year was actually to go from Europe down West Africa, and probably down as far as Conakry or so, and then either come part of the way back to Dakar and ship the bike back. And I thought the 690 is really going to be an ideal bike for that trip, for going through Western Sahara, Mauritania. It really was built for that stuff, and it was literally they were the routes it was put together in the factory to do. So. Yeah, that was a trip where I was thinking, okay, I'll get out on the bike and do that this year, but that obviously didn't work out.
Okay, well,
I'd really found some great tracks on doing my thing on the satellite images through a lot of those countries, and not this year.
With regards to the bike, as you know, I can go on and talk about that bike and the build of the bike and the details and everything for an hour, but that's not why we're here today. But if anybody does want to know all about why I built that bike, why I think it's the ultimate adventure bike for me, and that's really important. When I say it's the ultimate adventure bike, I mean for me and for what I want to do. Doesn't necessarily mean for everybody. But if you want to know all about the bike, I did a really cool podcast with Llewellyn Pavey. So Simon Pavey done the Dakar about 8 or 9 times, I think, maybe more. His son's also done the Dakar. He asked me if I would do a podcast with him. If you search it, it's I think the title's like Building the Ultimate Adventure Bike. Really cool. I talked through all the details of the bike and the build and why I chose it, and all information. It's about an hour long. So if you want to know all about the bike, that's the podcast to listen to. I'm going to put it on my Patreon page as well, so it'll be on there for everyone to see it. So we don't want to get into that on this particular podcast, but there's loads of info about that bike. So getting back to the discussion about bikes, and I think we can probably jump onto now the smaller adventure bikes. You know, I went from the 950 down. I used a 450 rally for a while. Then I did the Dakar in 2013. And then I realised that the bike that I built for around the world was basically a 450 rally chassis with a 730 single engine in it, so I had a bit more torque. But when we look at the manufacturers now, we've seen a bit of a change in the production bikes of all the manufacturers, heavily because of, for example, the Indian market, the Asian market, for the smaller bikes, so like 125, 200, 250s, 390s, and finally we've started to see the small adventure bikes. So with the launch of the 390 Adventure, I think they've just launched a 250 Adventure as well, Walter, I don't know if you saw that, and rumours of a 490 Adventure, but I'm not sure.
A 490 twin, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I'm not sure if that's actually an announcement or rumours at this stage, but you know, it would be great to have that smaller size adventure bike, and it's good to see the manufacturers doing it, because I think what it does as well, it opens up adventure motorcycling to the less experienced also, because the last thing you want to do as an inexperienced rider is to jump on a big bike, because it'll frighten you. It can injure you more easily because it's heavier, and it's a good place to start. You know, I hope that we see some learners and beginners on 125 adventure bikes getting out there and doing some adventure riding. And you know, we're going to come on to the discussion because some questions about it later, about, you know, what is really adventure riding, you know, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So with all that background, you know, right back to the beginning for the Dakar Rally, and then the big bikes, and then the change in the racing scene to the smaller bikes, and then now the trend going a little bit smaller in the production bike world as well. You know, we don't really need to talk too much about thoughts on the 1200cc class, 800cc class, you know, the likes of the 790 and so, and then the smaller bikes. I think they've all got their place in the market. There's still a market for them all, but the market size is adjusting in all of them. So
yeah, I think you know, there was a trend, if you like, from ever since Ewan and Charlie did their trip on the 1150s, there was a trend between there and about 2016, yeah, where every single bike that every single manufacturer released was bigger and more powerful than the previous one. So every single KTM that came out from, you know, if you start with the 640 Adventure, then there was the 950, then there was the 990, then there was like the 1090, 1190, 1290. Mm-hmm. And the 790 was the first time in ever that KTM built an adventure bike that was not the biggest adventure bike they'd built. And so, yeah, I mean, part of the driver, I think, is the Asian market. And I also think part of the driver is that just you can't build a bigger adventure bike and still really ride it off-road. I mean, there are no manufacturers now. If you look at the product line and the future roadmaps, there are no bigger yet adventure bikes in the pipeline. So everyone from Yamaha to Honda to KTM is looking to fill in gaps and looking to go down the scale.
I've seen some front-on pictures of the new 1250 GS, and I don't think you can go any bigger, right?
Yeah.
You can't physically go any bigger. Like, it's a big bike. It's a big old bike. You know, and also, like, you know, with you look at the Ducatis and the KTM 1290s. I mean, they're pushing what 160 horsepower, something like that. I mean, it's incredible. Like, it's really incredible. I mean, they are super fast. They're like a sports bike on the road with the capability to go off-road a little bit as well.
Well, yeah, you sort of realize how sort of nonsensical that is for off-road if you look at the old Dakar videos from the late 80s when Yamaha had 1 litre 4-cylinder Dakar bikes, but even then they were like 80, 90 horsepower, but they're doing 200, 220 kilometers an hour on the dirt. And you think, okay, well, if that's what you can do with 80, 90 horsepower, why the hell do you need 160 off-road? So that's obviously a road function.
Yeah. And for me, there's still a market for those people that can only justify one bike. They do a lot of commuting on the road, but they want the ability to go on the hard packed gravel tracks and have some fun with their mates on there too. I think there's absolutely a market for those bikes, and they've got the comfort for sure on the road, and they've got the passenger carrying capability, which is restricted somewhat on some of the smaller bikes, and people forget about that. You know, I still much prefer to take a passenger on the 950, 990, 1290 bike than I do on the likes of the smaller bike like the 690. So
absolutely, but that's not really you're not really going to do off-road riding with a passenger on a bigger bike. But
right,
and I know some people do tour around the world, but obviously they're sticking
mainly
pretty much to on the road or to sort of mild gravel.
And there's always an exception. There's always the one that race tour up or do extreme adventure tour up, but it's such a small minority. It's such a small number of people that they would never build something to meet that sort of market. So, okay, I think that's some really good discussion there about the bikes, and let's just talk. Let's tell everybody what you've got in your stable at the moment, because it'll take too long to go through all my bikes, but I'm sure people are interested to what actually have you got. We mentioned that you've got one of my builds, the
I do.
bikes. What else do you
have? I have one of your. Well, I have one of your. It was originally a 690, the one that you built for me, but it's sort of been had a bit of a weight loss by putting the 450 rear tanks on and a few other bits and pieces from the 450 just to save weight. I also I used to have. I recently sold. I had a BMW X Challenge, which I did a lot of my rides, the Sobieski Extreme rides with, and that was. Getting back to Simon Pavey, that was an ex-Simon Pavey bike. And I also have a Husaberg 570, which I've been doing up for about 4 years now and still haven't finished.
I think actually I think there's a question later on. When are you going to finish your 570, Walter? So you may as well tell us now.
Well, I was hoping to. Well, every year I'm hoping to do it, and if you asked me for the last 3 years, I would have said, it'll be ready this year. Or even in 2016, I remember being in Central Asia in Kyrgyzstan and telling some guys, it'll be ready this year. It still hasn't been ready. And this year I was determined to finish it. But of course, this year I haven't even been able to get to the bike. The bike is in Holland in a workshop, and I'm stuck in Moscow. Travel's pretty restrictive, so I guess it'll be ready next year. But it's one of those bikes that I probably, if I was starting from scratch now, I'd see if I could do something with a 501 just to have a spread, if you like, in the capabilities of the adventure bike. Those lighter ones, they're a lot less comfortable on the highway if you've got to do long stretches, whereas the 690 can kind of do it all.
And as a tall person, I personally find long distances on the small enduro bikes quite uncomfortable. I'm not saying that they're not capable of doing it. I just really struggle to find a comfy place on them. Even changing the seat, and they are just a small frame for me. I'm 6'4", so 192 tall, and long legs, so I find it pretty uncomfortable. But there's definitely a place for those in the market in the adventure motorcycling world.
Yeah, well, this bike, the Husaberg is really designed for sort of more technical stuff. I was thinking of using it in places like Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, where there's not much high speed, open stuff. There's a lot of twisty mountain trails, a lot of mountain trails where you have scree and gravel over the road that you have to sort of really work the bike to get it through those kind of rock falls and stuff like that. And for those purposes, I thought I'd rebuild the Husaberg, which I'd originally got from KTM in 2011, 2012 for the Andes Moto Extreme project. And I don't really have another bike at this point. There's just the two, and they kind of cover the broad range of adventure riding that I can sort of see myself doing in the next foreseeable future.
Yeah, you mentioned Andes Moto Extreme. Then just tell the viewers that don't know anything about that just briefly what it was and what you guys did with that, because that's quite a story too. Yeah.
Well, that was an interesting idea that I'd had for a while, and I was wondering sort of how to put it together and what guys to take on the trip. And in 2010, coming back from Siberia, I stopped in to visit a guy in Austria on my way back. I believe you know him, Lucas.
Yep.
And in fact, I think I ended up hooking you guys up. But I stayed with Lucas, and I was talking with Lucas about the idea. And at the same time, an American guy called Barton Churchill, known as Beta, who was on his way to Magadan, was also passing through Lucas's place. And the three of us were talking one night, and Lucas has an sort of military background, and Barton was a mountain ranger in the States. So I sort of flagged it to these guys, and everyone thought, yeah, this is a great idea. So over the next kind of 12 months, we put together a plan and talked to KTM, and they were prepared to be in it and provide the bikes. And the idea was to create a motorcycle altitude record, because it wasn't something that I'd sort of been pretty high, and I was pretty sure you could get a lot higher than I'd been. And it was a case of researching where would be the best place to do it. So we went down to South America, shipped the bikes down, and rode up to 6,361 meters, which was just under 21,000 feet.
Yeah, I think the highest I've been is about 16. Yeah, it
was about 20,600 or 20,700 feet.
Nice.
And that was really hard work. We spent a lot of time acclimatizing. Barton really knew that he was kind of our mountain director, if you like, and was really set the sort of schedule for the whole mountaineering process. And it was a cross between a motorcycle expedition and a mountaineering expedition. But we managed to get a world record at the time, and that was a lot of fun. And then I came back and I had this Husaberg, which I hadn't really used, but I knew it was great in the mountains, so I converted it for adventure, mountain adventure use.
Cool. And what is the record today? Do you know?
Yeah, Chilean guy's got about on exactly the same location. A Chilean guy's got about 110 meters higher on a Suzuki 450. I believe.
I can see it.
So it's like the world's highest volcano.
Project coming here.
Yeah, I actually, I've sort of been looking over the Topo maps, and having sort of been there before, I think, and so his record I think is 6,471 meters, which is 110 meters higher than we got. But looking at the Topo maps, I actually think it would be reasonably, I think you could get up to 6,550 meters, which is about another 80 meters higher again, doing a slightly different route. But
and a little bit more with some extreme enduro skills.
Yeah. Someone with a bit more extreme enduro skills than me. I mean, you bear in mind, you have to bear in mind the background I came from, which was traveling. So, my background on the bikes is not technical. But I do like blasting along at high speed.
Quite heavy bikes as well. You had a 570s. It's light, but it's not as light as you could go.
Well, I think it's basically a 10-year-old bike or more. I mean, the original, I think 70-degree Husabergs were released to the press in 2008.
Yeah.
So if you look at the KTM EXC bikes now, even if you look at the 500, which is similar horsepower to the 570, it's a good 10 kilograms lighter than the 570. And then of course you could even go lighter again with the sort of free ride kind of bikes, and and try that. So yeah, if you had a Lyndon Poskitt or a Graham Jarvis or something in your team in one of those bikes, I think you'd kill that record.
What about a Lyndon Poskitt and Graham Jarvis team? That sounds like doesn't it? Graham, if you're watching, give me a call.
I'll be the base camp manager.
Yeah. Cool.
I know the route.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Because obviously there's no. I mean, there's a trail. There's a sort of a trail up to about 5,900 meters. But after that, of course, there's no sort of vehicle tracks. You need to know a route up the mountain. And,
Okay, cool. Good discussion. I mean, we've been going almost an hour, so let's get on to some questions. And it's gonna get a lot of discussion because there's all kinds of questions we're going to rattle through. But we're going to go on the Patreon questions first. Some of the discussion points I've actually been leaving to wait till the questions because I know Walter will have something to say as well on them. Some questions we've already covered, so I'll just skip over them, but we'll just rattle through some questions. So, one from Ernie Hood on Patreon said, are any of the OEM bike companies working to build a true adventure bike for those that would be willing to buy one? Now, that's it's a difficult question because what is a true adventure bike? An adventure bike is what you make it. I know people that have bought a GSXR 1000 and ridden around the world and done some off-road on it, and that was their adventure bike. It's an adventure bike is, well, let's talk about that, Walter. What is an adventure bike?
Well, what's adventure motorcycling?
Exactly. What is adventure motorcycling? And what is an adventure bike? I think actually there's a question about what is adventure motorcycling later on. It's what you make it. And, it's about, you could sort of say, putting some adventure into motorcycling. Making it, what's the word? Making it different. Making it a challenge, if you like, to yourself. Doing new things. I see it as, I like to get out and do new things, go to new places, explore new places that I haven't ridden before, and places that other people haven't ridden before.
I'd certainly agree with that. I mean, I certainly try to do something new every ride, or if I don't do something new, then I don't really want to spend the time sort of publicizing it or anything like that. And for my own interest as well, I want to ride somewhere that I haven't ridden before. So you don't want to sort of do routes you've done before.
I'm absolutely with you on
You want
that.
Something new.
Yeah,
you want something new, and ideally something that somebody else hasn't done. So
And it's the same, I get asked if I'm doing the Dakar again, and I've done Dakar 3 times and I've done it different every time. And that's really important to me, is that I didn't want to do the same thing over again, So I did 2 South American Dakars, one I made a movie about, one I did a daily video series. But when I came to do the next race, which was the Africa Eco Race this year, I didn't want to do it the same way. So hence the team races to places. Everything that I do, even my adventure rides, I try and do something different every time.
Well, I think one of the advantages of that, Lyndon, is both in terms of the broadcasting coverage that you manage to put out, and also even the races to places ride. I think they've really pushed the boundaries of what people recognize as possible. I think the whole races to places adventure ride in the first place pushed the boundary out in people's minds about what's possible in terms of adventure riding. And certainly, like for me, all the stuff that I've done has been season long. I've never done anything longer than 6-7 months. And so to do it that much off road, not just for 3 months or 6 months. But to do it for multiple years, I think has really made people aware of that. And I think the detail and the quality of bike prep that you introduced in Races to Places is something that is long overdue in the market. I remember when I started preparing my Sibirski Extreme bike, I was getting flack for spending too much money or even getting decent suspension on the bike. And I think. People were saying, well, you should be riding around the world on a 1,200-pound bike. What if it gets stolen? Blah, blah, blah. But I think, and I think what you've done is really make people aware that you can actually do it with a really well-prepped bike. You can do it with a bike which looks the part. You can do it with a bike that actually is a tool for the job that you want to do. And I really think that you have been single-handedly pushed the bar out on that.
Yeah,
and the same goes with video. Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks, and I appreciate that. But what I also want to get out to everybody watching this, right? Just because I did it that way, and I raced and I did extreme travel and I went to places and I got stuck in the jungle and I got stuck in river crossings and flooded the bike, and just because I did all of that stuff doesn't mean to say that that is adventure motorcycling. For me, that was adventure motorcycling. For me, I had to push the limits. I'd raced the Dakar, so to do this round the world trip and to make the media content that I wanted to make, I had to make it different. I wanted to make it different. I wanted to make it interesting for people to watch, and I wanted to make it interesting for me to ride. And that brings a good point out. You have to do what's interesting for you. If you want to ride around the world looking at cathedrals, you should do that. You should absolutely do that. It's about what you want to do, not what you think people want to see. I didn't do Races to Places because I thought the world needed to see how you could do it like I wanted to do it. I did it because I wanted to do it. And I think that's really important. And I always try and get that across when I do my evening with Lindens with people is, you should absolutely do what you want. And an adventure ride for you might be going down to the shops, having a coffee in the morning. And speaking of which, that was perfect timing. Camilla just walked in with a cup of tea. Thank you.
Another one here, please.
Yeah, another one for Walter, he said.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right. If you look at people like Austin Vince, or yourself, or myself. I mean, everybody's got their own, or Chris Scott, or everyone's got their own style, right? Everyone has their own idea of what they want to get out of it, and then that defines how they go about doing it.
Yeah.
So yeah, certainly.
And my,
it's not about creating a formula and other people copying it. It's
Exactly.
about if you opening the boundaries of what people can realize is possible by doing things differently. And I think
absolutely,
you don't necessarily make other people ride around the world on a KTM rally bike.
No.
But I think what you've done is make people realize that if they want to ride around the world and have a well-prepared bike with great suspension, Linden's shown that there's nothing wrong with doing that.
No, exactly. And I pretty much chose the bike I wanted because I wanted to do long distance. It was a lifestyle for a long period of time, and I wanted to do racing. But equally, I really do get pleasure out of reading messages from people to say, watching Races to Places got me into motorcycling. I've got a CB125 and I just did my first adventure to the volcano in so-and-so in Indonesia. I mean, that to me is like, yes, you're getting out, you're seeing the world and you're doing what you want to do. It doesn't matter what you do it on. I could have done Races to Places on a 152 stroke if I really wanted to. Yeah, I'd have had a lot more maintenance and work to do along the way, but it's possible. And that's really important for people to realise that you don't need to have a load of money, you don't need to have a really expensive bike, and you don't need to do it how I did it to have a lot of fun and enjoyment, and that's really important. So when
you have a lot of fun, follow your own ideas.
Yeah, exactly.
Feel free to develop your own ideas and follow them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm even seeing people travelling and racing because they wanted to follow the same idea that I had. They wanted, that's a good idea. I've always wanted to do that, and they're now doing it, So it's interesting to see people, but don't think you have to do it how somebody else does it. Just get out and have your adventure. So that's a little bit about what we think adventure is, and, consequently, the adventure motorcycle is what you make it. So if you've got the bike in the garage, take it. I have people call me and say, I'm thinking about getting a 790 because I want to ride around the world, and then they tell me they've got a WR450 Yamaha in the garage, and I'm like, take it, save the money and take it. You'll have fun, you'll fix it where you need to fix it, and that's part of the story. So still on the same subject of bikes, and there's a couple of questions about this. I think it's quite important as well, from Bob Hancock and Jacob Naib. Both asked questions about suspension. One was how important it is to be able to flat foot a bike, because my bike is really tall. Mine has I think I can't remember what the seat height is, but it's high. It's like a meter or something. And you know, people say, is it important to have high suspension and more ground clearance or be able to touch the floor? And in my mind, I think you have to be confident is the answer. So if you are not confident not being able to touch the floor, then absolutely you need to be able to touch the floor. So I would say, and a number of customers of mine have had the bikes lowered, the factory rally bikes that they've got from me, the bike builds that they've got from me, they've had them lowered so they can flat foot it, because they feel more confident and more secure and safer being able to put the foot down on the floor. When you're a very experienced rider, you learn to like jump off the side and know when to put your one foot down and jump off the seat. So it really does come down to how much experience you've got, how skilled you are. But what I would say is, primarily, I would say, if you're unsure, be able to put your feet on the ground because it's going to make for a much more enjoyable ride. I think you'll agree with that.
Yeah, I think if you look at the sort of a lot of the top Dakar riders, a lot of them are quite small guys, and they certainly can't put both feet down, let alone flat foot. I mean, I you know, you obviously want to have as much suspension travel as possible, and you want the suspension set up so that you're using the maximum amount of suspension travel as possible, because that's what's creating your traction and comfort and everything. So I my personal preference, you know, I'm not as technical a rider as Lyndon, or as skillful a rider as Lyndon, especially in the tougher terrain. But you know, I still like to be able to touch both feet to the ground, but not flat foot. So if I can have both toes on the ground, that's enough for me.
Yeah, that's good to know. And I'm the same. Like some of my bikes, I think all of my bikes, I can tippy toe. You know, touch the floor with my toes, even on the big bikes. And I raced the 950 with 320mm travel suspension, and I could only just touch the floor with one foot. But I kept moving most of the time, and I knew when I did stop, I had to just step off to one side, you know. But certainly, I would say that it's much more confidence inspiring if you can put both feet on the ground. And if you feel confident flat footing, then I would recommend getting your suspension lowered and being able to flat foot, because you can bash your bash plate all day long, you know, having a little bit less ground clearance and a little bit less suspension capability, just to be able to be safe on your bike and know that you're not going to drop it every time you stop. So, okay. We've already talked about adventure riding and what makes it. Somebody said adventure riding just a fad. I think we've talked about adventure riding and what it is for quite a long time, so let's not go on too much about that. But he also mentioned a KTM 690 and he's been adventure riding it. This is Jacob Nabe again. You know, is that the ultimate bike? It seems like it's the ultimate bike. I don't think we need to get into that. I think we've talked about bikes so much. You know, you can take whatever bike you want as long as it's the right bike for you. So moving on to questions, adventure rides. So one from R. Evan Ritchie. I've traded in my adventure bikes, both 950s, for a 350 Dual Sport. You know, he's missing the big tanks on the big bike, not as comfortable on the pavement. But again, I think we've talked about it, Walter. You know, you can do the round the world trips on a small bike like a 350. You know, we've seen there's a guy from New Zealand that rode around the world on the 500. What's his name? I've forgotten the guy's name. Brapin Kiwi.
Aaron.
Yeah, Aaron. That's the guy. You know, top bloke. He had a 500. Rode around the world on a 500. Did some pretty technical trails, lots of off-road, bit like what I did, and he enjoyed riding his 500. Great. That's, you know, modern bikes are capable of it. I mean, I have 450 rallies with 400 hours on them, and I've not even opened the engines yet. They're reliable now, the bikes, you know. So the smaller bikes is definitely a possibility if that's the way you want to go. So Jonathan Magoni asked for you, Walter, this one. Would you repeat Sibirski Extreme on a new modern adventure bike? On your motorcycle travels, do you always have an emergency exit plan? Question.
Well, first part of the question, yeah, sure. You know, there would be a couple of options. I think if I were to do it again, one would be to just get something that's pretty that's very, very close to purpose from the factory, like an AJP PR7. You have to do minimum work to it. It's lighter than the bike I used 10 years ago. It's more fuel economical. Yeah, I'd take that and go. Or if I could sort of build a fantasy bike, I'd probably look at something like a KTM 500 and work out, how I could put a bike together based on that. Because as Lyndon kind of just touched on, I think the modern EXE adventure, the EXE bikes, particularly the KTM EXE bikes, are a world away from the EXE bikes of say 2006, 2007 in terms of smoothness, sophistication, reliability, economy. You name it. There's no reason why a modern KTM 500 can't be the ideal adventure bike platform for that kind of trip.
I think the one limitation with those bikes is the carrying capacity and the ability to attach luggage to it.
That forces you to pack light, which is another key question.
It does. It forces you to pack light. One thing I've found on the Enduro bikes, though, is the chassis are quite flexible. So when you start bolting weight onto the back of them, they become a little bit sketchy and a little bit more unstable. But it doesn't mean to say that that's not rideable. You can totally still use the bike like that. But that's why the factory rally bike, the 450, has a trellis frame, has a much stronger frame because it's got all the fuel bolted around it, 32 litres of fuel. So, yes, there's definitely the ability to take a smaller bike, and we're seeing it more and more. I see more and more people doing 1 week, 2 week, 3 week, 4 week, more adventures on small EXCs because they've got them, and they put some little Enduristan Blizzard bags on the side which have the ability to put some pants and socks and shoes and stuff in, and a little tent across the back. Go for it.
The second part of that question is there always an exit plan, and the answer to that is probably not 100% of the time, but most of the time. I mean, even when I was doing the BAM road, and I've done it a few times, but you're always conscious that if shit hits the fan, you can actually hail down a train. The trains will stop. It's such a sort of remote area. The drivers will stop for you and sort of get you out of there. They might not get your bike out, but they'll certainly be able to get you out. Yeah. There are some areas, like if you're doing things like the old summer road on the Road of Bones, where there are literally only 3 or 4 vehicles that are going to come along each year, and they're sort of expedition vehicles. For areas like that, you either need to be traveling with other people, or you need to have like a satellite messenger or something like that you can call for help with if you get into trouble. And I think those spot trackers, Delorme trackers, or Garmin as it is now, I think they're very, very helpful in giving you confidence that you can go into, if you like, they are your exit plan.
And that was exactly as it was for me, Walter. I mean, I had a sat phone, I had a Delorme InReach, and I had my mobile with me. If I didn't have mobile connection, I always had my communication device, which was my InReach. If I needed to make an actual phone call, I had my satellite phone, and I had those with me all the time. Yeah, I only used once in an emergency when I broke my hand in Tanzania. The rest of the time I just used it to make birthday phone calls and things like that. But I wasn't sorry to have it. They do work.
They do work.
The only downside, as with anyone travelling alone, is if you're unconscious or something like that, you can't do anything.
Yeah.
And that's when it's really important to have a satellite tracker and people to know where you're going. So there's actually a whole topic on that, and I'm doing an article about it at the moment for adventurerider.com. So keep an eye on my social media. In the next month or two, there's going to be an article coming out all about basically are you prepared for your adventure, and using satellite tracking devices and the such. So that would be really useful. Okay, moving on to the next one. Janas Divisa asked a clothing question, which is probably a good thing to discuss. We've both got lots of experience, Walter. So he says, in terms of clothing, protection and weight, what are your preferences? Layers, enduro harness, Gore-Tex all-in-one suits, and why? Al, do you want to go first or me?
You go first.
Yeah, okay.
I think you're going to be more knowledgeable on it.
Okay, what I would say is I've used them all, I think, and one thing I would also say is that any single system, whether it's the Climb Gore-Tex jacket system like the Badlands and stuff, Badlands and pants, or for example the lighter ones, the Overland and stuff like that I've used, or whether it's the layered approach like I use now. I use like Climb layering systems, so I use like base layer, mid layer, then I use a jacket, a body armor, then an outer shell, and then a waterproof stroke weather shell. So there's like 4 or 5 different layers. Personally now, I prefer the layered approach, but it's a personal preference thing, and not one of those systems would deter me from going on an adventure. You know, if all I had was, I don't know, an old Belstaff suit sat on the bed.
It's really not gonna make much difference to your adventure.
No,
at the end of the day, it's not gonna change much.
No, I'd just go and do it. Even with all the waterproof systems and everything, I've still been riding wet and miserable. Why? Because I fell in a river, you know, and the water went in the arms and the sleeves and the neck and everywhere.
Let's talk about Gore-Tex boots or things like that. Yeah, I mean,
exactly.
At the end of the day, on an adventure, they're useless. You know, they might be nice for going down the shop in the rain, but on an adventure, I think, you know, a lot of that stuff has the additional value it provides is very limited.
Yeah, and I think for me, nothing would stop me going. So I'd wear anything. I'd even wear just standard motocross gear with body armor and just take a rain jacket with me on a world trip. Literally, if that's what I had, that's what I'd do. You know, and there's cheap ways now to be comfortable and dry. And I think that's really important to mention. You know, you don't have to spend a lot of money to get some kit that works these days. But there also is a lot of kit with a lot of function out there, which costs a lot of money, which might be down your alley. So I think there's something for everybody. And personally, my preference now is layers, because I can decide what I want to wear. I don't have to have all the big heavy gear on when it's nice and hot outside. And also, I don't have to have a rainproof shell when I don't need it, you know, so I breathe better. So I can make those decisions myself, having the layering system.
I've actually come to a sort of similar conclusion recently, and I used to, I think, you know, both you and I, Lyndon, have sort of been involved at various times in sort of, in people like Climb and their product development and helping take it forward. I've certainly, in the last couple of years, switched away from the kind of more all-encompassing, all-purpose adventure suits to much more kind of lightweight. I wouldn't call them Dakar racing stuff, but more sort of almost more enduro type clothing. Yeah. And then with perhaps some sort of a rainproof shell.
Yeah, exactly.
At the end of the day, you don't want to spend too much time riding in the rain anyway. So if it's raining, you put something on so you can stop at the nearest hotel, because it's just, why ride in the rain? It's just not fun. And if it's not fun, why do it? I had a conversation probably a week or two ago with Yussi, the rolling hobo, about you know what he wears these days, and he again has the kind of in the boot adventure, enduro kind of pants and everything like that, and just he used to have a waterproof shell pants to pull over it, and then he realized that they don't really work that well anyway. So he's basically cut them off at the knee, and they're just waterproof shorts to try and delay as much as possible getting his crotch wet. Trying to keep your boots wet is kind of a useless exercise.
It's funny because at Dakar, like I did have a full waterproof setup, but in actual fact, after so long, I just left the pants behind, because it's one less thing to carry, it takes less time to put on, and as long as I had my, for example, if it was really cold and wet in the Andes,
if your chest is dry,
I had my electric vest and I had my waterproof shell. I didn't care what my pants were doing. If my boots from feet and legs from crotch were wet, as long as my body and my core was dry and warm, I was happy. And so that's literally what I did, and that's what I do when I go on local rides. I only worry about my top half, really.
I think that makes sense totally. I'm sort of in Moscow at the moment, and you know, winter in Moscow, you can easily be minus 20, but you go out outside in jeans, you'll have about 10 layers and really warm jacket and everything on. But your legs just stay warm in jeans. I mean,
but if you're on a world trip and you're riding in driving rain, then you want to have leggings as well. So. Okay, last question from Patreon then. Go on. Did you have something else to say?
No, that's it.
Good. Last question from Patreon is from Bob Hancock, and that's about river crossings. He said in Walter's episode 7 of your, is that episode 7, Walter? Is that of your
Yeah, that's it. Doing the Urals in Siberia, where there's one day and you cross this river 7 times.
Yeah.
And it's I guess it's just trial and error. You get used to sort of reading the river and working out where to cross. And my experience is that you cross the river, you see where there's a break in the water, and just upstream of the break in the water, where the water is still, but just before it breaks over the rocks. If you go like a foot or two just upstream of where it breaks, that's usually a combination of the shallowest and smoothest spot. Because once it breaks over the rocks, the water gets much faster. The rocks become larger and bigger. There's no accumulation of smaller rocks to have a smooth path. And if you go too far upstream of where it breaks, it's likely to be deeper. So the combination of a smoother path plus shallower path, you want to go just upstream of where it breaks over some rocks.
Yeah,
but in any doubt, walk it first.
And I was just going to say, I've had my experience of riding through rivers without walking them first, and
it's bad. It's bad experience.
I've had lots of success at it, and I've also had lots of failure at it. So one thing I would say that almost never fails is the widest part is normally the shallowest part. So if you're at a river, typically it's got a constant flow volume. So you look for the widest part, it's usually the shallowest part. But you got to look for fast flowing spots breaking through, because they can be deep. If in any doubt, walk it, I think is the safest thing. Like, just get wet, walk up to your waist in water if you have to, find the shallowest spot before you go through it, because you won't regret getting wet over dropping your bike in the river. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things I always tell people is stand next to your bike before you even leave on the trip. Stand next to your bike, work out where the air intake is, know where that comes up to on your pants.
Yeah.
And then go through the river and see if it came up to that mark or that point on the pants where the air intake is. And if it's within an inch or two of that, then I'd be pretty damn cautious. And or switch the engine off, push it over, and then
exactly. Yeah. And there's a lot of I've got into a debate myself on social media about fast flowing water. If it's a short crossing but it's fast flowing, like personally, if there's good solid ground, like at Dakar for example, we had some in South America. I personally like to stand downstream of the bike so that I can lean the bike into me, and then I have the engine running and I just walk across with it, right? I've also seen people standing upstream of the bike because they say, well, if the bike's going to get washed away, I don't want it to go over the top of me. What I would say about that is if I thought the bike was getting close to be getting washed away, I can get out of the way pretty quickly. But, I found it much more successful to be in control of the bike, have it pushing against me and me triangulating the bike and not having the bike flailing away from me. So standing downstream and the bike pushing into me has been more successful personally.
And I also think if the impact of the current on the bike varies as you go through different areas, and you suddenly get a bit of an extra push. If you're there to, as you say, triangulate it, you can deal with that. If you're trying to pull the bike while it's going away from you downstream, you got no chance.
It's gone.
No chance.
Yeah. And the last thing I want to do is lose my bike downstream. I've seen it at Dakar, and it's not pretty. So,
you don't get it back for a long way.
No. So obviously with all of this you have to take extreme caution. But there's some interesting points that I think people might find useful from our experience. Okay, so that's all the Patreon questions. Now we're on to the Facebook and Instagram questions, and I've grouped the first few. I've just grouped into categories because I thought they were useful categories. So the first one's light versus heavy. I think we can pretty much that. I think we've discussed it enough, Walter, about light bikes versus heavy bikes.
Yep.
So
I think everybody knows our opinions on that one.
So thanks for your questions, guys, on those, but we're going to skip over those. Next one's an interesting one we haven't discussed: mapping solutions and planning. So I'll just quickly read through the questions because there's a few different ones, but I can't even pronounce the guy's name, but it looks like Sam something.
Sam van Spruwel.
You got it.
Yeah, he's a Dutchman. He's a Dutchman.
You know him. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I met him in Moscow earlier this year. He actually
cool.
came through. He was planning to do a trip, I think, to Mongolia or Central Asia, and needed to get his visa. Or he needed to visit once in order to be able to get a multiple entry visa. So he popped in and came to say hi.
Cool. So he asks about which map do you use on your GPS, and I think it's really useful. Really, what software mapping do you use for your GPS, particularly in Asia, but also if you're riding around the world. Like personally, I used OSM OpenStreetMaps. Is it Garmin.openstreetmap.nl? I think it is.
And then you can download the OpenStreetMaps for and then just load them into.
Download them for free. They're detailed enough. They're mappable, routable.
Well, they're really the best you're going to get. I mean, the once you get away from the from Europe and North America, the quality of actual maps that Garmin themselves actually provide is very poor. So once you get away from the West, you really need to be using the OpenStreetMap maps. And then there's plenty of tutorials on the web about how you download them and then load them onto your Garmin device. I've started recently also using tablets. I know some people use phones. There's Samsung make a couple of rugged tablets which are waterproof, drop proof, and all that sort of stuff. And on those you can really push the boat out in terms of software. Again, there's OpenStreetMap software. There's a software which I'm using now called Locus, and Locus allows you to have it's obviously like any sort of Garmin or whatever. It's a moving map display, so it shows you on the map in your direction of travel, and you can either have it north up or direction up or whatever. But what's really cool about the Locus is you can actually change the map background. So you can either have the OpenStreetMap maps. You can change it to Google Maps. You can change it to satellite maps. You can change it to Topo Maps. So there's sometimes where you might be somewhere and there's no detail, or the detail in OpenStreetMaps is clearly wrong, and you can just press a couple of buttons and you actually see the satellite map. So you can see your position on a satellite background, zoom in and out and everything like that on the same thing. So it's useful because it changes the actual map source while keeping you in exactly the same position in your direction and the functionality of the device. So
that's good to know.
That's one of the useful things that's out these days.
Cool. Next question for me, Brian said, what sources of info do you use? We've just talked about it. And do you ever just wing it? And I think looking at the next question from Sam again, one of his questions was, do you exactly plan the route up front, or do you just make adjustments while on the road? I think this is really important to discuss this, because when I travelled on Races to Places, right, at first, the first 30,000 kilometres of Races to Places were routes from you, Walter, to pretty much from Greece, Turkey, right across to Magadan, were routes that I got from you. And they were fantastic routes. It was a great adventure. It was all planned up in front. I knew exactly where I was staying on a night, or if I didn't, I had an idea where there were places to stay and get fuel and this, that and the other. But then as Races to Places went on, I didn't have that luxury of information. And I actually found it quite an adventure not to have a plan up front and not to have a specific date to get to somewhere, and to just make it a lifestyle, travelling and exploring. And oh, this looks interesting, I wonder where this goes. And then a local telling me, oh, there's this really great place over here. Oh yeah, and I could make a route round that way, around a lake, instead of the other way, which I was thinking of going. And made it up as I went along. So I don't think there's a right or wrong way, but personally what I would say is having an indication of what you want to achieve up front is great, but then being flexible with your planning as you go along is also really rewarding. So both sides.
There's pluses and minuses. One of the things that I think is a problem when you wing it is you don't know if a road's going to actually get through, or if it's a dead end, or if you're on a track in the middle of Kazakhstan and the track splits, if you don't know if that's going to turn around and end up going literally 120 degrees in the opposite direction that you want to go. And so having, in that sense, having the track mapped and prepared, knowing that track will get you where you want to go, can be useful in remote areas. I think in less remote areas, it's a lot easier to wing it. Play it by ear. I think in remote areas, you probably want to have some prep and have a track mapped out and planned. If you're sort of crossing a
Yeah.
remote area of the Sahara, you want to know that the track you're on
Yeah.
gets you to a town
Yeah.
within X amount of range.
I did a lot
Otherwise,
of I did a lot of go to point, shortest distance on my world travels. So I'd just be like, oh, I'm gonna get to this town, but I'm gonna go the shortest distance, so it takes me through all the countryside and everything. That's dangerous. Like, you can get into trouble. And if you remember Costa Rica, when I was back with Lucas again for a little bit with Tony, do you remember we did that, and we ended up down this big steep hill, and we couldn't get back out. It took us 10 minutes to get down there, and it took us 12 hours to get back out. So you've got to be really careful, and you've got to know the topo of the area and what you're doing. So you do have to plan it a little bit, because if you don't, you can get into trouble. So but generally that makes the adventure. So for me, I'm okay with winging it now. I like just going out and winging it a little bit. So, but I've got a lot more experience now than I had before I started my trip. So
I think that also makes sense. I think if you're sort of starting a trip, it might be an idea to have more planned, but also leave more scope in the second half of the trip or whatever to wing it, because you're going to have a much better feel internally about what the map says versus what that means in reality. Whereas when you start off, you're kind of a bit green, and you don't necessarily know how to translate the map into reality as much, and it's useful to have more guidance.
Yeah.
But as you get more experienced, you get a lot better at understanding what is likely to mean.
Yeah, you definitely do. And the last point from Aubrey Thomas that I saw, which is interesting, navigation then and now. I'm presuming he means in the olden days versus now. And we mentioned that at the beginning somewhat with the Dakar Rally.
Yeah.
They were navigating with a lot less sophisticated stuff than we have today.
Well, they still try and keep that in rallies now, right? They keep GPS out of it, except for security, and they still have basically a piece of paper with an arrow and in 1 kilometer turn left.
Yeah, I think adventure navigation now with GPS technology and maps, OpenStreetMaps that are available, and information that's generally available about traveling around the world in different places, it's much easier now. From an adventure perspective, you can go on Google Earth, you can plan your route, you can see if there's a way through, you can see if there's landslides, you can see all of it up front. And with the business down here in Spain, that's how we plan our routes on Google Earth. We go on and we research it all and look at what's possible. Then we go and run it to see if there's things you can't see, like gates and fences and private land and all that sort of stuff. But navigation for sure now from an adventure point of view is easier. From a rally perspective, it's the same as it was back in the day. It's just safer because there's safety systems.
You've got the GPS backup,
safety
but
systems
you can't use it to navigate. Yeah.
You can't navigate on the backup, but you can call the organisation. The organisation knows where you are, and you can route to a waypoint. You can get an arrow to a waypoint to get you back on track if you get lost. So there's ways to get you back on track. You can't, and you get a penalty for that, but it's safer now. So I think, rally racing for me, the navigation stayed the same. In some respect, even with the electronic road book that's coming in Dakar, it's still the same. You still have to navigate based on instruction, and then if you get wrong, you can find your way, but you get penalised for it. And if you have an accident, they find you. So I think it's just the time of the times that it's safer now. So.
What did you guys use in Salt and Gold?
GPS, yeah. So we just
had GPS then, okay.
GPS tracks, on navigation.
And sort of Lomax had waypoints or something like that.
Yeah, we had waypoints. We had waypoints and known routes as well. You could see. Again, you could see from satellite and things. You knew where. So
like any of those sort of Gandini tracks or anything like that. Because like in 2000 and 2009 when I did the first Sibirski Extreme trip. I did it with paper maps. I had a Zumo. I think it was a Zumo back in those days as well. But once I left Europe, it was reasonably useless, with the sole exception that it would record my tracks.
Yeah.
Because even back then, OpenStreetMap was pretty primitive, and a lot of the remote tracks in Russia and Mongolia, I actually ended up drawing from those recorded tracks that I made in 2009. So things like the Bam Road and the Road of Bones and All Summer Road and stuff are all things that actually I put on OpenStreetMap because they weren't there, based on the tracks that I made. But in 2009, I did use paper maps, and I had these like big detail maps which I'd sort of scanned, had cut up, and then had drawn like in yellow highlighter pen my planned route across them, and then I laminated them, and I literally had half a pannier with about, I think it was 80 to 100 laminated A4 sheets, which I'd sort of double side printed to save weight and size. The double side printed, laminated, and then I for my dash, I actually had a bulldog clip and basically a clipboard. It was like it was an aluminium sheet coming down where the GPS now sits, and a bulldog clip on the top of it, and I would put these laminated sheets on there, and that's how I navigated in 2009. So it was.
I did that in the US. Well, my
liberating to change.
I had it on the top of my tank bag.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, next, moving on to bike-specific questions. I think we've had enough about bikes. I'm just looking through all the stuff's been discussed, weight, ability, reliability, height, suspension. We've discussed a lot of it. As I say, if you want to watch about the Ultimate Adventure Bike, it's the podcast I did with Llewellyn Pavey. That's really interesting about that stuff. But just looking through, we've already talked about the concept of an adventure bike, and is the term abused? We've talked about that. Best modifications for people's bike. I think we don't want to get into too specifics. So I think the only thing, there's nothing really in the bike section that I want to do more. I think we've covered it enough. The term adventure rider, we mentioned about that. It was actually Aaron that asked what's the difference between a motorcycle rider and an adventure rider, and I think we did touch on that a little bit, so we probably covered it already when we just said about taking the adventure for you and things like that. And then another one that's guy Vizian said, do you think adventure motorcycling has become too commercial? Well, of course certain aspects of it have become commercial, but that's just made it appropriate for people to see it and experience it and have the ability to do it themselves. I don't know what you think about that, Walter. I don't think it's been an adverse.
No, I don't. I think being commercial is fine. I mean, the being commercial means that there's even accessories for people to sort of buy and fit on the bike. I mean, if you even look back 5-6 years, there were no good kits for things like the 690. Now there's a whole bunch because it's become commercially viable.
Exactly.
If it wasn't, you're back to the sort of world where you're literally fabricating everything yourself. And while I know some guys that have got the skill and talent to do that, a huge majority of us don't. So having some commercialism in there is not a bad thing. It just actually makes a lot of things viable, which otherwise wouldn't be.
Exactly. Another really interesting topic, social media and how it helps. And there's questions from Spike Reed and.
That's for you, man. You're the king of.
Yeah.
My social media presence is pathetic.
Okay. I'll try my best then. And also from Dean de St. Croix, he asked some questions. So first from Spike Reed, joining social media groups a must, so that your progress can be followed and offer help not only in the case of breakdowns but accommodation also. It's not a must, absolutely not. But some people said to me it must be a drag keeping up with social media and everything. I did it because I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the interaction with other people as I travelled around the world, and I absolutely opened up opportunity for doing it. So I'm glad that I did it. I found it really useful, and you know what? I met so many friends all over the world that I wouldn't have met if I wasn't on social media. So for me, social media was definitely a positive tool. For sure, it became a little bit of a drag sometimes, especially when you give yourself challenges to make sure you post something every day, something useful and interesting. Sometimes you don't want to, but the benefits definitely outweighed the drawbacks for me. But some people, might not like to share their experiences and might not want to see what they're doing and want the pressure of it. That's fine, but you just won't get the benefits. So it's your call personally. One from Dean, how did you balance the need to share with the need to generate revenue through social media? Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, one thing that I learned is actually generating revenue through social media is really difficult. It's a challenge, and in some extent through my social media I don't get anything. I mean, my revenue, anything that comes in towards projects and to pay for editing and everything, comes through Patreon. So www.patreon.com/Lyndon Poskitt. It's those people, my patrons, that get priority previewing on all my videos, including these podcasts. They're the ones that help me to be able to continue to do this. Actually, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, all of that, there's no revenue from that. That's just...
I think it's worth just, sorry, Lyndon, I'm just going to butt in and just add something here. I think there's a bit of a misconception that there's actually money in adventure motorcycling, and if there's one thing that I've learned after sort of, doing it for 30 years, there's almost no money in it at all. It is such a small market. If you want to get money from social media, you need to be a bikini model. You'll get 30 million followers and you make a lot of money.
Gaming.
And you'll get people pay you, people will pay you $10,000 to post promoting their product.
Yeah.
Adventure motorcycling is such a small scene and such a small market that, if you're really lucky and you're doing really well and you're a high profile person, if you even get equipment to use for free, that's as good as you can really hope for.
Yeah, because there's so many people out there doing it now. Even getting equipment is quite difficult, because there's so many people out there doing it. But the thing that allows you to leverage getting more, like for myself, is giving more, and giving more takes more effort, more time, and more money. It's like editing the videos. So, you really can't expect to get a lot without giving a lot, and that's one of the things that I've learned over the years. And I can't thank everyone enough that supported me, all the companies and everyone. It's really been like going to school for 5 years to learn how to do it, and even now I still have a business and I still work every day.
Yeah, and I think people also have to sort of bear in mind, as you sort of touched on, you don't get stuff or you don't get anything for just doing something. You've actually got to give something back. So
of course.
In the case of my projects, the only ones that I sort of basically got some sort of sponsorship for were ones where there was a clear plan to generate a certain amount of media or whatever, whether it was the Tokyo to London trip or the Sobieski Extreme trips, and you've got to you've got to have the credibility. You have to have people believe that you can actually deliver on those promises. You have to have a plan to get an audience. But you have to build the credibility that somebody in a company can say, okay, well, this guy says he's going to get X amount of publicity for me. On what basis is he saying that? Is it just a hunch or a hope, or does he have a track record of doing that?
Yeah, that's it. Last question from Dean. Are you more connected now than ever? Yes, I think so. Has that changed from when you started to now? I.e., how do you make it not feel like a job? Well, it is a job. Like this morning with you, Walter, we've been planning this for months, to pull this together and to get all the questions from people all over the world and to get the time to sit down, to record it, to get the sound, and then we've got to piece it together after and get it released out. It's a job, and I think it's fair to say that we both do it, Walter, because we love adventure motorcycling and we want to share our experiences with other people. That's why I'm doing these podcasts, is because I think it's a way to share thoughts, experiences, and people can listen to this while they're traveling in the car, they can listen to it while they're in the office, on the headphones, whatever, and they might just pick up some information that's useful to them, and that's what this is about. It's about sharing information, experiences, and giving somebody something fun to listen to from our experiences. So yeah, it's a job, but it's a job that I love, and I've been doing it now for probably 5 or 6 years, or 6 or 7 years now, social media and creating content, and yes, it becomes a chore from time to time, but ultimately I still enjoy it. And one thing I really enjoy is the feedback from it. So when we get the interaction after we release this edit, for example, that's fun. Talking about new topics, and I think this, no, I don't agree with that, I think this, and that's kind of interesting. So it brightens up my day, all that stuff.
I always like the idea of actually getting people to think about various aspects of adventure motorcycling, things that they never necessarily thought about before, whether it's thinking about packing differently, thinking about planning a route differently. Because if you can actually have a positive impact on the way people think about either choosing an adventure motorcycle, packing an adventure motorcycle, planning a route, then that's satisfying to be able to.
And that's a whole new thing you just mentioned there, packing an adventure motorcycle, and we're not going to get into it on this podcast today because we're already nearly up to 2 hours, I see. So, last few questions. Let's talk about the current climate, Walter, because I'm sat down here in Spain at the moment, currently in a small lockdown situation where we can't leave our little province again. And that's restricted some of the movements I plan to do and some of the business stuff that I plan to do. You're stuck in Moscow there, and I think a lot of people have not been able to go on adventures that they want to go on, and there's some questions here about how COVID will impact adventure motorcycling going forward, and also things have changed as in a political climate, over the last years, and how has it impacted adventure motorcycling. But I think COVID is probably the most interesting one to discuss at the moment, because earlier this year we saw a lot of people all over the world traveling and had to just pack everything up and get home. Or sit it out where they were, and that's big.
Well, they'll still be sitting.
that hasn't happened for over decades. So it's a new era that we're in, and I'm seeing now people slowly starting to get back out traveling, but I'm also seeing this second wave of COVID coming, and that impacting people also. So what do you think? What do you see it going, and how do you think the impact will be on adventure motorcycling, Walter?
I think it'll be significant in the short to medium term. I don't think anything is going to be as easy as it was in 2019 for probably a decade. Certainly for 4 or 5 years. I think borders are going to be harder to cross. I think there'll be more restrictions, whether it's, even if it's simple stuff like having to pay for and then do a test at the border and then sit there for 2 hours or something, whatever, until it comes in, or God forbid if it's a small remote border crossing at a poor country, you might have to sit there for longer.
Exactly.
So I don't know, but I think the impact is going to be negative, and it won't be as free as it was for quite some time.
I think that's right. And also what we've seen is the COVID situation has impacted the political climate around the world as well. So we've seen clashes on borders because of COVID as well, and restrictions and changes in rules in one country compared to the bordering country and all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it just, for me, like, I feel so lucky that I finished Races to Places when I did. It was like the perfect time to finish.
You even see hostility towards foreigners arriving in the country now, especially in a lot of the third world countries. If you're in somewhere like Senegal and you fly into Dakar Airport, people don't want to come anywhere near you because it's all just feared that you are a carrier of disease.
Yep.
Especially you're coming from Europe, you're coming from one of the hotbeds of the disease. You've come to infect us. So there's increased hostility to strangers and.
Yeah, I mean, all the travellers that were in Mexico, and sort of, Central America during the big pandemic, the first sort of few months of it, the world global lockdown, they were having rocks thrown at them and all sorts of threats, and they all just had to get out of the country. It's really, really crazy. So I think it's going to be some time before it gets back to the point where the big world travel stuff can still happen, but people don't think that you can't have adventure. Like, I'm going out locally on a weekend doing one day rides and I'm still having a blast. That's an adventure for me. So do what you can, get out and enjoy yourself.
It's going to be an additional planning complication, but that doesn't mean adventure motorcycling stops, that's for sure.
Exactly. One from Dean, again another question from Dean de St. Croix, said, is it easier now or harder to travel the world by motorcycle? My personal opinion is that it's easier. It's easier because people have done it. There's lots of information out there. There's systems in place like carnets for your vehicle. There's GPS mapping. There's all this stuff that just makes it easier today than it was in years gone by. Look at, is it Elspeth Beard? She travelled around the world with a map, basically nothing. Just that was hardcore. I think I had it easy with the GPS and all the information and the Facebook contacts that kept reaching out to me. It made it a little bit
everything.
easier.
The security devices that you have, the fact that you can take one credit card, you don't even need to carry cash anymore. You can just travel around the world and just bung the card into a machine at the border. In so many thousands of ways, it's easier now because of the availability of information and services is so much greater than it was.
Okay, so last few little questions. There's so many that we've covered, so it's going to wrap up with a few here. There's one that I've highlighted here, which I think is a funny one that you're going to have to answer, Walter. Can you both compare the attributes of travelling with polo shirts?
This will be
over to you.
That will be fun. Okay.
Yeah, it was fun here.
Let me tell you the advantage of polo shirts. I can think of about 4 or 5 really strong advantages of polo shirts. Firstly, one of the most practical things about polo shirts is they have a collar. You pop up the collar and you don't get a chafed neck from your rough surfaced riding jacket.
Good point.
Hang on, I think did I just lose a feed? No, okay, the video feeds are good. No, it's okay. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is the reverse of that. Not only does it protect your neck, but it actually protects all the sweat and the dirt on the neck, making your jacket really filthy. And the jacket's much harder to wash than the polo shirt. So you might as well get your polo shirt dirty. It's a lot easier to wash. Thirdly, if you compare the polo shirt to a t-shirt, the much wider knit means it actually is a lot cooler in summer. A t-shirt's quite a dense knit. It also makes it much easier to wash. It's a lot more effective washing a polo shirt in a stream or whatever than it is washing a t-shirt. There's and lastly, if you're in, say, Irkutsk or Yakutsk in Siberia, and it's Friday night and some locals invite you to the local discotheque, you're going to look a lot more presentable in a shirt with a collar. In fact, a lot of places won't let you in a t-shirt, but if you've got a polo shirt, it's basically a t-shirt with a collar. Yeah. No problem, you're in. You've got a collar.
Yeah.
So, a polo shirt is just a poor man. A t-shirt's just a poor man's polo shirt. So I go the polo shirt every time.
I wonder if I had a polo shirt when I stayed with Bern when I was in New Zealand. I think it was. Can't remember if I had polo. I must have had, because I had polo shirts everywhere I went. So
there you go. She's got polo shirts on the brain, so you must have had. You must have had.
All right. One interesting question from Ben Pinkston was, what is the current state of the Old Summer Road? That's actually a good question, because I'd like to know that. And when were the last people to pass it on moto, and is it still passable? So I know the new bridge has gone in at the west side, yeah?
Yeah, there's a new bridge on the west side. It's the road to as far as Tomtor from Yakutsk is better than ever. However, the road after Tomtor is still abandoned, and obviously that means it just deteriorates. There actually is a new bridge just after Tomtor, because there was as you can recall, Lyndon, there's there's 2 within the first 15 kilometers or so after you leave Tomtor. One of them got washed away a few years ago, but they fixed it because it's still that when you go east of Tomtor, the first 60 kilometers is still used by hunters. And there's a couple of abandoned villages there. That's been fixed. But then you've got the 160 kilometer abandoned stretch, which is still truly abandoned and only ever gets worse. The road still gets done. It still gets done by 2-3 groups, if you like, of adventure motorcyclists each year.
It's not a lot.
It's not a lot. It's, as I said, if you break down there and there's no way out, you have no satellite device, you could be waiting a couple of weeks before the next vehicle comes along, because it's really only expeditioners that use it. But there's as you recall, Lyndon, there's a lot of water crossings. You've got to be prepared to get really, really wet, really, really cold. And you've got to do a lot of physical manhandling of the bike, whether it's in bogs or whether it's getting it across rivers. It's still really hard work, and it's still one of the great challenges out there.
It is, and if you haven't seen it, everybody, Races to Places, I think it's season 3 or 4, Road of Bones, Races to Places, Road of Bones on YouTube. Pretty fun to watch, some good stuff on there. Okay. Views on and similarities in mindset between adventure biking and competing, racing, rally racing. I think the question's for me, and the mental challenges. Honestly, I've just written an article for adventurerider.com, as I mentioned earlier, about do you have a plan? And for me, adventure motorcycling is exactly the same as rally racing, just without the competitive side and the timing. Like, I don't race any different to how I do a fast adventure ride, except I push myself because I'm against the clock. The mindset, the preparation and everything is just the same. You need to be prepared, you need to have everything lined up, you need to know where you're going, you need to have a game plan. So it might be interesting to read that article that came from Small Bear on a Bike. So it's coming on adventurerider.com in the next week or two. I think we've talked about future trip for you, Walter, and how do you plan for food along the route? Well, that's an interesting one. Find it where you can, and always have a stash on the bike of tins of stuff is my plan.
I mean, generally speaking, if there's a town or village, there's going to be food of some sort. There's going to be a shop of some sort. You're going to be able to get something. You're not going to get what you want, but there'll be biscuits or there'll be Mars bars or whatever, and you learn to, and there'll be some crappy local food cooked up, and you just that's the deal. You suck it up.
One thing I learned about traveling the world, that it's a massive bonus. I eat anything, absolutely anything. And I can stomach quite some terrible things. So for me, it was great because I could just
don't
eat
be
anywhere.
A fussy eater.
Yeah, you can't be a fussy eater. Really good question again from Ian. Ian O'Brien asked that question, but he said, "What is the greatest memory for both of you guys from the Subursky Extreme routes?" And I think for me, doing the old summer road and the BAM with Lucas. And just some of the fun times we had, like drowning bikes, Lucas's battery going flat, just all kinds of amazing stories of and they were the best stories for me are the most difficult ones, the hardest ones, the ones where we got challenged. That was for me the best parts across that route.
Yeah, I guess I have a lot. Things like the old summer road is great, the BAM road is great. I also just like when you're in Russia or Kazakhstan and just blasting across the steppe and you almost feel like you're a racer. You just thinking in your head, how hard do you push? How much sort of margin for error do you sort of keep in your speed? Mm-hmm. There's a whole bunch of different things that at different times that really suits the mood of whether it's a more challenging technical thing or whether it's a faster section or whatever. But yeah.
Interesting question from Martin S. Do you still believe the half helmet is better? Walter?
Yes and no. I mean, again, probably depends. Depends on the actual ride. I still use the sort of open face helmets. It's something I sort of inherited from Austin Vince, actually.
Yeah. I think
it allows
you to connect with people more. And I often longed for a flip-up helmet as much as I really dislike them, because you could just flip it up and smile at people, and they see your face.
But they're heavy as fuck.
Yeah, and there's immediate interaction.
Yeah.
But to be honest, it takes 5 seconds to do that and pull my helmet off. And I used to do it. I used to stop and immediately take my helmet off if I want to talk to someone, because I always wanted to make face-to-face contact and not feel like I was behind a shield, So I prefer the safety of the full face with the mouthpiece, and I just take it off quickly if I need to. Is my thoughts these days.
Yeah, I use some for some rides, the others for other rides. I think there's some really, really amazing lightweight MX Enduro helmets out there these days, which the fact that you can get a really good full face helmet for 1 kilo, 1.05 kilos or whatever, it's just insane at a pretty reasonable price. Some of these kind of Aero Aviator style helmets are just and the vision you're getting from them gets better and better with every edition, every model. So. Yeah,
absolutely. Quick question from Tristram84. Tristram also owns a Linden Poskitt Racing rally adventure bike and is planning a world trip that got stopped due to COVID. So looking forward to seeing what you've got come in Tristram. But one of the questions he asked, which I think is useful, is have you managed to connect with local riders while on trips to find places no one hears about? Absolutely. And that's one thing social media did for me, is I got a lot of suggestions, because you tend to know the great riding places local to you. So as you're traveling around the world, whether it was Tasmania, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Alaska, I just met so many locals that gave me information that made my route for Races to Places what it is. So definitely connecting with locals, and definitely through social media, gives those opportunities and options to find new places. That's certainly what I found anyway. He also asked, and in remote areas, have you kept yourself safe? We've already talked about that, and the backup plan and the equipment. I think with regards to equipment and first aid and things like that and spare parts, it's difficult to discuss. If you read the latest article I've done for Adventure Biking, it's got a big equipment list for first aid and also for safety. But in terms of tools, it depends which bike you've got, and spare parts as well. So just be prepared is what I would say. And we're pretty much wrapping up now. Finished that one, and just getting these last kit lists, same thing. Just razzing through these last few questions. We better not. I don't know if we can ask that. Did you see the one from Wes there? A question from Wes. How many Mongolian brides does Walter have now? Over to you, Walter.
Well, I can actually say none, and there have never actually been even close to any Mongolian.
It's a common misconception.
Actually, to be honest, I actually found Mongolians to be much more sort of suspicious of outsiders than, say, the Russians, who I always found the most sociable of all the sort of various areas and countries that I've sort of been riding through in Sibirski Extreme.
Yeah.
So Mongolian brides nil, and no close encounters there either.
Yeah. And
at least not with Mongolians.
Question from Dane Morgan. Biggest question of all: what oil do you run, Walter?
Well, I mean, oil, I guess, is a sort of a pretty wide question. But look, I run synthetic oil. I never subscribed to the sort of view that people had that synthetic oil was not good for long rides or anything like that. So yeah, for me, it's just a case of good quality synthetic oil. I think with Linden, your choice of oil is pretty clear on the motorcycle on the picture behind your head there.
Yeah.
I've either used Motorex or Motul, and but always like the top grade stuff.
Yeah, good brand, top grade, the right specification for your bike. End of discussion.
Yeah.
Okay, last two. Okay, so you got into adventure motorcycle, and because of disillusionment with backpacking scene, you got into adventure motorcycling. Is there a danger of that in adventure motorcycling scene in the future, Walter?
Well, not really, because I think people are doing actually a lot more individual travel now than they even did 10 years ago. I think certainly in the areas that I'm familiar with, people used to ride to Mongolia and Siberia in groups of 6-10 guys. Now there's a lot more guys going in groups of 1 or 2, or so that automatically seems to create enough variety in the sort of trips that people are doing, that they're not following sort of pre-prepared routes or pre-planned box ticking exercises. There are one or two things, like if you go somewhere like Ulaanbaatar, it seems everybody stays at one particular guest house in Ulaanbaatar, which I tend to avoid for exactly that reason. But generally speaking, I think there's no kind of Bible that everybody follows this particular route and whatnot, and even routes where there's no choice, like the Road of Bones or the BAM Road, they're just not widely travelled. They're still only travelled by a handful of people each year.
Yeah, and I think the last question, to wrap it up, is from Jonathan Wilkinson. I think it's a good one to wrap it up on, and that's about the future bikes, and will electric bikes and lightweight everlasting batteries ever become into the adventure motorcycling scene? You know, he's put what would people like? Who's that? Anatoly? Who's that? Anatoly
Chernyshevsky. Yeah, he's a Russian guy who's been doing some remote areas in Russia.
On an electric bike?
No.
So what would
he's
he do if he had a lightweight electric bike which never needed recharging, which is obviously not going to happen. But it's an interesting point with Long Way Up just come to air with the electric Harleys that they're travelling on, and you know me, I've experienced the electric bikes with the Alta Motors and the Erzberg project in 2018 and really loved riding those electric bikes, and there's definitely a space in the future for electric motorcycles. Personally, I think they're a long way off where they need to be. Certainly for an adventure motorcycle, because obviously there's limitations at the moment with charging, other than if you do the same route as you and Charlie on Long Way Up, because there's a charging station every 100 miles, I think, installed now, if they're still there. What do you think? Electric motorcycles?
Well, I think it would be naive to say that it's never going to be the thing, because the way technology moves,
absolutely.
It's obviously moving in that direction. Governments, whether we like them or not, are moving in that direction. The technology will be there, and it's a case of when it will be appropriate.
Yeah.
You know, it can well be that, you know, the size of a motorcycle battery is going to be relatively small compared to, say, the size of a car battery. So it'll be a lot easier to charge, say, if you're traveling from village to village in Siberia, to charge up an electric motorcycle every night. The key is obviously going to be work out how you're going to get enough range to go from village to village, and then sort of hassle some local.
Those are exact problems that you and Charlie experienced on Long Way Up.
Yeah.
You know, so I think it will get better. It will, of course, get better. It's not going to get worse. Technology improves, designs improve, you know, facilities improve, and infrastructure around the world is going to improve. So
it's going to happen whether we like it or not. So we might as well just accept it. It's going to happen.
I think it's going to come first as a commuting bike, city bike, which we've already got it, and then a travel bike. I think in terms of long distance adventure bike, it's going to come later.
And who knows? I mean, you know, the fact is, everything we associate with electric bikes these days is associated with these, you know, lithium-ion batteries.
Yeah,
that's not necessarily going to be the source in future. You know, whether you can get a much denser power source from, say, hydrogen or something like that, generating the electric current.
Oh yeah.
There can be massive improvements in battery technology. Let's say there's graphene batteries which are 10 times as energy dense as lithium-ion batteries, and, you know, they can be around in 10 years' time. So, you know, don't only think of electric bikes being the technology that's around today, because the technology that's around today, is intermediate. It's intermediate technology. You know, this is the technology that's been in cell phones for 20 years, and now they're just applying it to cars. But there's going to be better technology in the future, much better than lithium-ion batteries, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Walter, I think that's it from a question point of view. If there's anything else you'd like to add, I think it's been a really great discussion. It's just over 2 hours long, I think. And I can't wait to share it with people and get people's feedback, whether they like it, what they want, if they want different things going forwards. So thanks very much for your time. Is there anything else you want to add before we close off?
No, I'm cool. It was great fun. It was great to sort of hear the questions that everybody had, and to jump up with my 2 cents worth, and to hear your opinions as well, Lyndon. And I think it's a good format for people to listen to going forwards, and to learn different opinions from different people with different specific areas of experience and expertise. Yeah,
I hope so. I hope to get people in from different things. You know, maybe like from somebody with some luggage in one of the luggage manufacturers, or, you know, friends from the motorcycle industry or things like that, just to get different opinions and thoughts on things, and just have a discussion, interesting discussion, and prompt some thoughts for the people around the world. So I've really enjoyed it. It's gone faster than I thought. It's 2 hours. Hope there's some interesting stuff in there for people, and if the people can let me know what they think to it, and we'll get some more interesting ones going. So thanks, Walter, for being the guinea pig and being the first one.
Thanks for having me.
Number one, and take care, and we hope to see you out on the motorcycle soon.
Excellent. Cheers, Lyndon. Thanks.
Cheers now. Thanks, everyone. Bye.